What happens when a reckless tourist decides to mess with a royal guard? You won't believe the shocking twist when the guard strikes back. Watch till the end and tell us, did the tourists get what they deserved? Drop your thoughts in the comments. The sun beat down relentlessly on London, casting long shadows across the cobblestone streets as tourists milled about, phones in hand, eagerly capturing memories of the city's iconic landmarks. Buckingham Palace stood proudly in the distance, its grandeur towering over the masses, while the majestic royal guard stood at attention, the very picture of discipline and tradition. Ethan squinted against the sunlight as he nudged his friends, his eyes locking onto the solitary guard standing at the entrance to the palace. A playful glint danced in his eyes as he scanned the area, searching for his next bit of mischief. His friends trailed behind him, a few steps slower, their conversation fading as they caught up to his mischievous energy. "Okay, this is it!" Ethan grinned widely, his voice louder than necessary. He motioned with a sweeping gesture toward the royal guard. "I've seen this on TV a million times. These guys never move. Watch me mess with one." Sarah, the most cautious of the group, looked over at Ethan with a raised eyebrow, her face filled with concern. "Ethan, don't. They're serious. You can't just—" Ethan cut her off with a dismissive wave. "Relax," he said, his tone breezy and confident. "It's just for fun. What could happen?" He flashed her a grin, the kind of smile that usually meant he was up to something outrageous. Sarah rolled her eyes. "I swear, if you get us kicked out of here—" "Come on, live a little," Ethan said with a wink, practically pulling her along as he marched toward the guard. The rest of the group hesitated for a moment but followed Ethan, albeit with a mix of concern and amusement. The guard stood still, his tall black bearskin hat perched perfectly on his head and his crimson uniform sharp against the bright blue sky. His posture was immaculate, unwavering, stoic, and seemingly impervious to the surrounding crowd. Ethan was already sizing him up, eyes scanning every minute detail of the guard's rigid stance. There was something almost otherworldly about the royal guard. People around them giggled, posing for pictures, trying to make faces or strike silly poses in front of the guard. But the guard didn't budge. The closer Ethan got, the more he could feel the attention of the crowd shifting in his direction. It was like they all knew what was coming next, and they were waiting with bated breath. Ethan could almost taste the tension in the air. The guard's eyes were fixed straight ahead, his gaze piercing the distance with a look of quiet determination. His expression was as cold and impenetrable as stone, and for a brief moment, Ethan actually felt a flicker of doubt. But the doubt was fleeting, soon overtaken by the thrill of the challenge. He couldn't back down now. "Watch this," Ethan whispered to his friends as he edged even closer. He could hear Sarah muttering something behind him, but he wasn't paying attention. His mind was locked onto one goal, the guard's iconic bearskin hat. Without any hesitation, Ethan reached out, his fingers brushing the smooth surface of the guard's uniform before quickly and decisively grabbing the hat off his head. "Gotcha!" Ethan laughed triumphantly as he lifted the guard's hat high above his head, holding it up for the world to see. The crowd around them gasped, a mixture of surprise and amusement rippling through the onlookers. Some tourists cheered, some laughed, others stood frozen, unsure of what to make of it all. Ethan turned to face his friends, grinning ear to ear as he posed with the stolen hat like it was his prized possession. "Look at this, guys. This is going straight on my Instagram. #Royal Victory," he said with a mischievous wink, quickly raising his phone to snap a selfie with the stolen item in hand. His friends burst into laughter, the tension in the air lifting for a brief moment as they took in the absurdity of the situation. But amidst the laughter, something else happened. The guard's posture, which had been almost comically stiff until now, seemed to change. The air grew heavy, and Ethan's grin faltered slightly as he noticed the subtle shift. The guard's eyes, which had previously remained fixed straight ahead, flickered to the side, just for a brief second, but long enough for Ethan to feel the weight of his actions. The amusement around him began to fade. The tourists, still unsure of how to react, quieted down. It was as if the energy in the crowd had changed, turning from playful to uneasy. The guard's shoulders stiffened, his movements growing slightly more deliberate, his gaze narrowing as it locked onto Ethan. Ethan, suddenly aware of the danger he'd put himself in, felt his stomach twist. It was no longer funny. It was real. But it was too late to back down now. The moment of recklessness had already passed the point of no return. The crowd around them fell into an eerie silence. The only sound was the soft, rhythmic click of the guard's boots as he took a single step forward. The sound of Ethan's laughter, which had been so carefree moments earlier, slowly died down as he realized the gravity of the situation. The guard hadn't moved dramatically, no shout of outrage, no flurry of action, just a slow, deliberate step forward. But that step was enough. It was as if the entire atmosphere shifted, the air thick with a sudden tension that made Ethan's stomach drop. Ethan froze, still holding the hat high in the air, his smug grin slowly fading into uncertainty. The guard's eyes remained locked on him, a cold, unwavering stare that made Ethan's skin prickle. There was no smile, no hint of humor. This was serious. He turned to his friends, his voice a little shakier now. "Guys, I think I might have gone too far." Before Sarah could respond, before anyone could process what was happening, the guard quickened his pace, moving with a fluidity and precision that seemed almost unnatural. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. His stomach clenched in panic. Without thinking, Ethan spun around and bolted. "Wait, what's going on?" Sarah shouted, her voice barely cutting through the chaos that was quickly escalating around them. The others followed behind, hesitant at first, but the sound of the guard's boots clacking against the stone floor behind them was enough to send the group into action. Ethan's breath was ragged as he pushed through the throngs of tourists, trying to weave in and out of the crowd. His legs burned from the effort, but his adrenaline pushed him forward. Each step felt like it was a race against time, each heartbeat louder than the next. The royal guard wasn't just walking anymore, he was chasing. Ethan stole a glance over his shoulder, his pulse quickening. He could hear the clack of boots growing louder, faster. The gap between him and the guard was closing in an unsettling way. The guard, who had stood so still just moments before, was now gaining on him with frightening speed. "Not good, not good," Ethan muttered, panic creeping into his voice. The distance between them was shrinking with each stride, and despite his sprinting, the guard was closing in on him. "Where is he?" Ethan gasped to himself. The twisting maze of tourists and barricades providing no escape. The palace grounds were a sea of faces, all oblivious to the high-stakes chase unfolding before them. But for Ethan, the world had narrowed into one singular focus, the relentless pursuit of the guard. He glanced around frantically, hoping for an out. The crowd was thick and his body was starting to slow, but the guard didn't seem to be losing any steam. In fact, he was cutting through the crowd with a smoothness that made Ethan realize just how outmatched he was. Every step the guard took was a calculated one, a sharp and precise movement that spoke of years of training. There was no hesitation in the guard's stride, no fatigue in his breath. This wasn't a casual pursuit, it was professional, methodical, and swift. Ethan's legs felt like lead as he tried to push himself faster. But the guard's relentless pace made it clear that he wasn't going to give up. His mind raced, but all he could focus on were the piercing sounds of the boots getting closer, closer still. He turned another corner, praying for a shortcut, but it only led him deeper into the throng of tourists, each of them now turning their heads in confusion as the chase unfolded before them. Ethan's chest tightened and his lungs burned for air, but he couldn't stop now. The guard was too close, and the weight of the hat in his hand now felt like an anchor, slowing him down with each desperate step. The crowd parted for the two of them as they sped past, tourists stopping mid-photo to watch the spectacle unfold, but no one moved out of Ethan's way fast enough. His mind scrambled for a plan, but the guard was relentless, moving faster than Ethan could have ever imagined. As they neared a set of stone stairs, Ethan's stomach lurched. There was no way to outrun him now. He had thought he could outrun the guard's discipline, but that assumption was rapidly crumbling in the face of reality. Just as Ethan's foot hit the next step, the guard, without breaking a sweat, sidestepped a small group of tourists who had slowed down to take pictures. In one smooth motion, the guard's long stride closed the final gap between them, and before Ethan could react, the guard's hand shot out, nearly brushing Ethan's shoulder. It wasn't a rough grab, but the sheer speed and precision of it made Ethan's heart skip a beat. The next step was inevitable. The guard was there, inches away, too close to escape. Ethan's breath hitched in his throat as the world seemed to slow down. His eyes widened, and for a brief, terrifying second, he thought about tossing the hat aside and surrendering. But it was too late for that. The guard's presence was towering, unyielding. Ethan's hands trembled, his mind frantically searching for a way out, but his legs, weighed down with panic, refused to cooperate. The guard's face remained a mask of indifference, but the tension in his posture told Ethan all he needed to know. This wasn't a game anymore, and Ethan had made a costly mistake. The seconds stretched, the chase coming to an abrupt halt, and the silence that followed was deafening. Ethan's heart hammered in his chest, every beat like a loud drum in his ears. His legs screamed in protest as he rounded yet another corner, his body desperate to find safety. He thought he was almost out of the maze of tourists and barricades, but then he saw it. A second royal guard stood at the other end of the narrow path, blocking the exit. The sight of him, standing perfectly still with that imposing hat perched atop his head, made Ethan's stomach drop. His escape plan had crumbled. He was cornered. Okay, this is bad," Ethan muttered, his breath coming out in ragged gasps. His body was exhausted, but the adrenaline kept him moving, making every inch feel like a struggle. He could feel the weight of the stolen hat in his hand, and the consequences of his actions weighed even heavier. The first guard, still pursuing, was closing in quickly. There was no way to outrun him now. But just as panic set in, a new idea shot through Ethan's mind. Without thinking, he ducked into a nearby souvenir shop, praying for some kind of miracle. The small shop was crowded with tacky trinkets, postcards, and miniature statues of the palace, crammed together in chaotic piles. It was the perfect place to lose himself in the mess of souvenirs. The narrow aisles, littered with cheap "I Love London" t-shirts, magnets, and keychains, offered a tiny hope of escape. Ethan quickly crouched down behind a rack, clutching the hat close to his chest. His breath came in short, desperate gasps, and his heart thudded in his chest as he tried to steady himself. He could hear the sounds of the pursuit, booted footsteps growing closer. The first guard was fast, moving with purpose. Ethan's pulse raced. "Please don't find me," he thought. "Please don't find me." Through the small gaps between the souvenirs, he saw the first guard enter the shop, his sharp eyes scanning the room with an almost predatory focus. Ethan held his breath, praying he wouldn't be spotted. His back pressed against the rack, and the fabric of the "I Love London" t-shirt slightly brushed against his face. The tension was unbearable. If he just passes by? For a moment, it seemed like luck might be on his side. The first guard's gaze swept over the rows of shelves, his eyes moving past Ethan's hiding spot as he continued forward. Ethan's body trembled with relief. He felt a brief, fleeting sense of victory. But then, the second guard entered. Ethan's stomach dropped. His heart lurched into his throat. The second guard's presence immediately shifted the dynamic. The doors creaked open behind Ethan, and the heavy clack of boots on the stone floor echoed through the cramped shop. The second guard, with his intense, cold eyes, entered without hesitation. Ethan felt the rush of panic in his veins again, his breath hitching. The moment he'd feared had arrived. His hand, still clutching the hat, shook slightly, and he realized he was still holding the stolen hat. It was the only thing that gave him away. The second guard's sharp gaze locked onto the hat instantly, narrowing as he made the connection. Ethan's body tensed. The guard's eyes shifted to Ethan, piercing through the rack of shirts. He didn't even need to say a word. The entire room seemed to hold its breath as both guards turned in unison, their movements synchronized with eerie precision. Ethan's heart sank. There was no hiding anymore. The thrill of evading capture had faded, replaced by the crushing reality of his situation. The guard's gaze was unwavering, their eyes trained on him with an almost mechanical focus. A small cough, a slight sound from Ethan's side, betrayed him. It wasn't loud, just a quiet exhale from the pressure of holding his breath too long, but it was enough. The guard's head snapped to him immediately. They moved toward him with unyielding resolve, their expressions still unreadable, but their presence made it clear that the game was over. Ethan felt the heavy weight of his actions in that moment. He was trapped. There was nowhere left to run. The guards approached, and the sound of their boots on the stone floor grew louder with each step. His mind scrambled for some way out, some last-ditch excuse or plea, but his thoughts were clouded with fear. It was no use. He let out a long, slow sigh, the tension leaving his shoulders, and resigned himself to the inevitable. He was caught. Ethan stood frozen, his legs like lead beneath him. The two guards moved toward him in unison, their presence imposing, their silence almost suffocating. Every step they took seemed deliberate, calculated. The heavy weight of their uniform, the stern expressions etched on their faces, was enough to make Ethan's stomach twist with a mix of guilt and fear. One of the guards remained slightly behind, his eyes fixed on Ethan, while the other, the first guard, extended his gloved hand toward the stolen hat, a motion that felt almost ceremonial in its precision. "This is highly disrespectful," the first guard spoke in a low, controlled voice, his tone oozing authority. His words hung in the air, more a statement of fact than a reprimand. The intensity in his voice sent a chill down Ethan's spine. Ethan, still panting from the chase, could barely find his voice. His thoughts scrambled for any possible way out, any excuse, but none came. The exhilaration of the prank was long gone, replaced by the heavy realization of how wrong he had been. "I'm sorry," Ethan muttered, his voice weak and hesitant, but the guard didn't respond. Instead, the second guard, who had been standing in the background, spoke in a voice as cold and unwavering as the first. "You will accompany us," the second guard said firmly. "There are consequences for actions like this." Ethan's heart sank as he realized there was no escaping this. He was no longer in control of the situation. The guards began to move toward him, their silent presence dwarfing him as they guided him back toward the main square. The crowd that had gathered earlier, intrigued by the spectacle of Ethan's chase, now fell silent. The once laughing tourists looked on in stunned silence, some with curiosity, others with judgment. Ethan's friends watched in silence, their faces flushed with embarrassment. Sarah, who had been the most worried from the start, looked away, unable to meet Ethan's eyes. The once jovial atmosphere had now shifted to one of discomfort and tension. Ethan's cheeks burned with shame. He had been the center of attention in the most humiliating way possible, and he could feel the eyes of every onlooker on him. The first guard moved ahead, his pace steady and sure. With a swift, precise motion, he pulled a small piece of paper from his uniform and extended it toward Ethan. The paper, crisp and official-looking, was handed to him with no-nonsense authority. "This is a fine for your behavior," the first guard said, his voice calm but heavy with the weight of the situation. "You'll pay it immediately, or we'll be forced to involve local authorities." Ethan's heart thudded painfully in his chest. He reached out instinctively to take the paper, his fingers shaking as they brushed against the smooth surface. His stomach dropped as he read the words. The fines amount more than enough to wipe out his weekend budget, and then some. Panic surged through him. "Wait, I didn't mean to," Ethan began, his voice cracking as he desperately tried to explain himself, but the second guard cut him off. "No excuses," he said sharply, his eyes piercing through Ethan. "The matter is non-negotiable. This is the consequence of your actions." Ethan's mind raced as he processed the gravity of the situation. It wasn't just a playful prank anymore. He had crossed a line, and now there were real consequences. The laughter from earlier had disappeared entirely, replaced by the uncomfortable murmur of the crowd. The tourists who had once found the whole ordeal funny now watched with a mix of curiosity, judgment, and in some cases sympathy. A few whispered among themselves, pointing in Ethan's direction, while others simply stared, some with looks of disbelief on their faces. The heat of embarrassment spread through Ethan's body like wildfire. His cheeks flushed crimson as he glanced nervously at his friends. They stood awkwardly to the side, unsure of what to do. Some of them looked uncomfortable, while others were trying to stifle their giggles. Ethan's friends, who had laughed along at first, now realized the seriousness of the situation, and their unease was palpable. His gaze met Sarah's briefly, and she gave him a tight-lipped smile, but there was no humor behind it now. She had warned him. She had tried to stop him, and now it was too late. The first guard spoke again, his voice cutting through Ethan's spiraling thoughts. "You will pay this fine," the guard said with finality. "If you do not, we will have no choice but to involve the police. Ethan's mind spun. He had hoped to be the center of attention for a few laughs, but now the whole thing had spiraled out of control. This isn't a joke anymore. This is real. His stomach churned as he imagined how much worse it could get. What could happen if he didn't pay the fine right away, or what the authorities might do if they got involved. The reality of his recklessness hit him like a ton of bricks. He had embarrassed himself, his friends, and now the two royal guards who had clearly been trained to handle this kind of disrespect with no tolerance. Ethan wasn't just the guy who pulled a prank anymore. He was the guy who got caught stealing from the royal guard. He could hear the distant sound of other tourists muttering, a few snapping pictures of the unfolding scene. But for Ethan, the entire world seemed to blur out of focus. All that mattered now was that piece of paper in his hand, and the cold, unyielding eyes of the guards watching his every move. Ethan stood frozen, the fine still clutched in his hand, the weight of his mistake pressing down on him with an intensity he couldn't escape. He had expected more punishment, more humiliation. Perhaps the guards would take him away, or the authorities would arrive, and he would be escorted off the grounds in disgrace. But just as he was about to speak, perhaps to apologize, perhaps to beg, the sound of steady, measured footsteps approached. Out of the corner of his eye, Ethan saw the head guard step forward. The atmosphere shifted once again, his presence commanding the space. He was the highest ranking of the guards, a towering figure whose composure made everyone else seem momentarily insignificant. His uniform was identical to the others, but there was something about the way he carried himself, his silent authority, his unwavering stance, that made it clear he was in charge. For a moment, Ethan thought he might be in for a lecture, a further scolding, maybe even a harsher consequence. But when the head guard spoke, Ethan's heart skipped a beat. There was something unexpected in the guard's voice, something that wasn't the usual stern reprimand. "You've caused enough trouble," the head guard said, his voice steady and measured, yet there was a flicker in his eyes that caught Ethan off guard. His expression remained as stoic as ever, but his gaze softened just enough for Ethan to feel the change. "You're lucky," the head guard continued. "Consider this a warning." Ethan stood there in stunned silence. His mind raced as the words sank in. He had expected anything but mercy, and yet here it was. The gravity of what was happening left him speechless. For a moment he simply stared at the head guard, not fully understanding what was unfolding. Then, the head guard did something that Ethan never would have anticipated. With a slow, deliberate motion, he extended his hand toward Ethan, taking the stolen hat from the first guard and holding it out to him. "Return it to its rightful place," the head guard said, his voice firm yet not unkind. "And don't test us again." The weight of the moment hit Ethan like a wave. His fingers, still trembling from the rush of panic and adrenaline, slowly reached out and took the hat from the guard's hand. As he did, the crowd, who had been holding their breath the entire time, exhaled in relief, their murmurs slowly returning. The tension that had built up around the scene began to dissipate, but for Ethan, everything felt heavy. He opened his mouth, perhaps to apologize, but no words came out. His throat was dry and his mind was still reeling from the unexpected turn of events. What could he say? How could he explain the stupid decision that had led him to this point? As the head guard turned and made a slight motion, the two guards fell back into their original positions, resuming their stoic stances as if nothing had happened. Their professionalism was absolute. There was no lingering judgment, no more words, just a return to the same unyielding discipline that had been present when Ethan first approached them. Ethan stood there for a moment longer, feeling utterly small under the weight of the situation. The crowd around them had started to disperse, the tourists' chatter growing louder once more, but the eyes of the onlookers still seemed to linger on him. He could feel the eyes of his friends on him as well. Sarah was the first to speak, her voice low and hesitant. "Ethan, are you okay?" Ethan didn't answer right away. Instead, he slowly turned, still holding the hat, and began to walk away. His legs felt shaky, like he was walking in slow motion, but his mind was racing with 1,000 thoughts. The walk back to the edge of the palace grounds felt like it lasted forever, each step a reminder of how foolish he had been. The silence among his friends was deafening. They all walked alongside him, but none of them spoke. Some looked at the ground, others stared straight ahead, and Sarah, who had been the most worried from the start, seemed to be battling a mix of relief and disbelief. Ethan's cheeks burned with quiet embarrassment, and every step felt like a reminder of the reckless choice that had nearly spiraled completely out of control. He had learned his lesson, perhaps the hardest lesson he could have learned, but it didn't change the fact that he had crossed a line, and now he had to live with the consequences. As they reached the entrance of the palace grounds, Ethan glanced back once more at the royal guard. They stood motionless, unmoving, still as statues, no sign of what had just transpired. It was as if the moment had never happened. The guard's silent authority remained intact, and for the first time, Ethan truly understood the weight of their duty. As Ethan and his friends made their way out of the palace grounds, the tension that had hung over them finally began to lift. The crowd, now mostly dispersing, seemed oblivious to the drama that had just unfolded. Ethan's phone buzzed in his pocket, breaking the quiet walk. He pulled it out, expecting another mundane notification, but when he saw the message, a grin spread across his face. It was from Mike, one of his friends who had been watching from the sidelines during the entire chase. "Ha! Worst selfie ever! Hope it was worth it, Ethan." Ethan couldn't help but laugh, shaking his head. It wasn't the kind of victory he had imagined, but it was definitely memorable. Still, a part of him was grateful that it hadn't gone worse. "You know," he said, still chuckling, "I think I've learned my lesson." The others laughed nervously, clearly relieved that things hadn't escalated further. But then Sarah, who had been the most apprehensive from the start, spoke up with a wry smile. "I'll bet you don't mess with the guards again." Ethan looked over at her, a sheepish grin on his face, and replied, "Not in a million years." His voice was full of newfound respect for the royal guard and their unwavering discipline. Some things are just not worth the risk. His friends, while still uneasy, seemed to nod in agreement. Even Mike, who had made light of the situation earlier, appeared to have gotten the point. They were all walking a little slower now, more thoughtful, as they exited the palace grounds. It wasn't just the fine they were concerned about anymore. It was the very real reminder that some things, no matter how small they seem, can have much bigger consequences than they appear at first. As they stepped out onto the street, Ethan glanced over his shoulder one last time, looking back at the guards. They still stood as motionless as ever, completely unfazed by the chaos that had just unfolded. It was as if nothing had happened. No chase, no stolen hats, no tourists running for their lives. The guards remained the perfect embodiment of calm and stoicism, silently observing the world around them. Ethan couldn't help but admire the calmness they exuded. Despite everything, they hadn't wavered once from their duty. They had remained firm, unfaltering, and in control. But as his gaze lingered on them, another part of him felt relief. He wasn't going to have to answer to the police. He wasn't going to face the wrath of a full-scale international incident. And, most importantly, he was leaving with his dignity and his wallet intact. The fine had been steep, but far less than what it could have been. He turned back to face his friends, who were now in much higher spirits. It was clear that the situation had shaken them, but they were all recovering quickly. They exchanged some quiet laughs, the kind that came from a shared experience of awkwardness and relief. As they walked away from the palace and toward the nearest pub, Ethan felt something different about the air around him. It wasn't the lightheartedness that had filled him earlier, but there was a quiet sense of respect for authority, for traditions, and for the way that a single impulsive decision could change everything. "Let's just say I'll be keeping my distance from the guards next time," he said with a dry chuckle, trying to break the lingering tension. "Good plan," Mike said, grinning. "You've got a reputation now. If anyone asks, we were just watching the whole thing go down." Ethan laughed, but his mind kept drifting back to the royal guards. He knew he'd never look at them the same way again, not with the same carefree attitude that had led to his disastrous stunt. Instead, he'd see them for what they were, symbols of duty, discipline, and an unyielding sense of responsibility that had, in the end, been the real lesson he needed to learn.